Okay, so now we're moving on to a workshop on the superintendent's recommendation for continuing and phasing out services funded through the Coronavirus Relief Fund after December 31st of this year.
Yeah. So what we're doing now is discussing the next steps with our COVID Relief Fund and what you can expect in the coming weeks. As you know, the governor, at the behest of the Economic Recovery Task Force, prioritized supporting school reopenings. And with the generous support that we received, we've been able to manage school reopenings in a way that allowed us to provide hybrid instruction for our students in pre-K through 9 and positioned us to be able to transition to remote instruction successfully if and when that time comes. The funding has been used for a large number of improvements in our infrastructure, such as windows, outdoor classrooms, ventilation improvements, et cetera. And it's also been used for the purchase of laptops and other devices for student and staff to help with remote instruction, which we talked a little bit about earlier tonight. These are all capital improvements that are done and are paid for mostly. You heard about the technology purchase. They've been paid for, and that we would not have been able to do without that funding. It's been used also to procure personal protective equipment for staff, cleaning supplies and equipment, and things along those lines. But the funding has also been used to make our instruction and managing our daily health and safety protocols at the school level possible. That's included paying for a significant number of staff positions that enabled us to backfill staff who had accommodations or took leaves due to COVID-related factors. And it's also enabled us to create our remote academy to serve most families that were concerned about in-person instruction for a variety of reasons. And as you heard earlier today, Remote Academy has over 800 students in it. CRF has paid for in-school substitutes and support staff to manage the daily symptoms checks, social distancing, mask enforcement, and other health and safety routines. And it's paid for additional ELL and special education staff as we've prioritized students with special learning needs for more time in school. CRF has also paid for our amazing community partners who, thanks to this funding, have rallied to create learning opportunities on days where hybrid students are not in school to make it possible for families to have a semblance of normalcy in their daily and work schedules, as well as to provide additional social opportunities for students who were otherwise isolated for way too long this past spring and summer. In short, CRF funding has been pivotal to our efforts and has made our school reopening success possible. The funding, as you know, is scheduled to end on December 31st. And this shouldn't be news for all of the continuing board members, and hopefully for our new board members, you are also aware of this as we've been talking about it throughout the fall. Since August, we've been talking about it. And so as the moment approaches when we will no longer be able to rely on it as a revenue source to support our efforts, we are bringing to you a recommendation for what to continue and what to not continue to support. So you had the first read of my recommendation, which, as you saw, is to discontinue the bulk of our community-based programming so that we can continue to provide hybrid instruction in our schools. I want to emphasize that I do this with a heavy heart as I understand the importance of this programming for the 500 students who have taken advantage of it during the past 3 months. We have been working with the partners to figure out what can be sustained in terms of programming. And I'm happy to report that we have a good level of confidence in our ability to provide ongoing support for the children of our Portland Public Schools staff who are taking advantage of these programs. We're also working with the city's recreation department to determine the extent to which they will be able to continue to provide before and after care for students on the days that they're in school for in-person learning. So now I'm going to ask Executive Director for Budget and Finance, Miranda Fasullo, to review what we call the enduring costs associated with continuing our investments with you, and also discuss some of the areas in our approved FY21 budget where we believe that there are savings as a result of a different approach to schooling. Then we'll go into my recommendation on some of the details of how that actually plays out on the budget, and talk a little bit about our rationale for that, and then we'll look forward to discussing it with you.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
Javier, can you just expand upon community programming for those that are new and for a review for those that have been here? When you talk about community-based programs, could you just elaborate on that?
And we will have more details
coming up.
But the community-based programs are, the programs like the REC, which is an before and after care for students, so that on the days that we have a shortened school day, when children are in school, that they have a place to come before school and to stay after school to sort of match more closely the schedule that most people working in, in the larger economy have. And then also programs like the Boys and Girls Club, and we'll detail all of the different programs that we've had where on the days that students are not in school, so that, if you're on the A cohort on your days where you're not in school, so that would be on Tuesdays and Friday, that would be the day that would be the place that you would be able to go for support. So we'll be talking about both, the numbers of students involved as well as the costs associated with that. And that's what we, what my recommendation is, that we are not able to continue to support into January and beyond.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will go ahead and get started. Can everyone hear me and everybody see my screen? Okay, so good evening, everyone. So welcome to the new board members, and congratulations, Ms. Figdor. It's great to see you as chair up there. I'm just going to start off, the superintendent said some of this, but just with a quick overview kind of the context that we're in right now with respect to our coronavirus relief funds. So basically over the last 4 or 5 months, we've been able to claim approximately $10.5 million in coronavirus relief funds. And these funds all have an end date of December 30th of this year. So $10.5 million is not actually our full, what our full allocation was. We had an allocation of about $14 million, but given the restrictions and the timeline of the grant, in the end, we were able to claim and utilize about $10.5 million. Approximately 2/3 of that budget funded the one-time investments that the superintendent mentioned, so tech, facilities, supplies by and large. And the latter 1/3 of the budget funded those kind of continuing staffing and service costs, in particular, our childcare programming, and all of those things have, of course, cost implications to continue. We call those continuation costs or enduring costs. So that's what we're referring to when we use those terms. So at this point, with no expectation of an extension of CRF funding or any new funding, at this point in time, what we're doing here is evaluating what programming we do and do not have funding to continue after December. So I'm just going to start off with what those continuation costs are. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about precisely what these FTEs are, how many FTEs we have in each of these categories, because we have a slide that goes into that a little bit later in more detail. But for now, I just want to focus on, the kind of categories of costs and the costs associated with each category. So you've heard the term backfill a bunch tonight. So backfills in order to be able to have staff in remote academy. So basically people with permanent positions moving into remote academy, and then backfills in their school locations to provide in-person teaching. We have about 38 FTEs, and that's by far and away our largest cost, continuing cost at about 1.6 million. We have a few FTEs for administrative and other supports at Remote Academy, about 200,000 there. We have 8.5 FTEs for specials, which is critical to scheduling, classroom scheduling, and that's about $300,000. We have a few additional FTEs for ELL programming at $175,000. Again, some additions in special ed, 120,000 or so. And then we have our building subs. So these are subs that were hired to work daily and be present at each school location to provide consistent daily sub coverage. There's about 35 of those positions at a cost of just under $500,000. And then building aides, which are providing more administrative support at the building levels, approximately 30 staff in that category at a cost of $170,000. So when I say at a cost of, $3 million overall, I mean for us to continue all of these positions from January through the rest of the school year. That's approximately what we're looking at, about $3 million in staffing costs. So shifting into our day programming costs, our two largest partners, the Boys and Girls Club and Rec together, come to about $880,000, and all other partners come to about $935,000 for about $1.8 million in enduring costs past December. And then lastly, it's not something we've talked about before, but one other notable enduring cost, because it's a purchase of its supplies, but it's perishable supplies, so we can't buy it all up front, is $110,000 or so for a snack program at the schools. I guess I'll continue, and we can take questions unless anybody has their hands up. I can't see, so just interrupt me if there's any questions. So moving into some of the...
I have a question. I do have a question. Just to get a clarification on the building heads, we have about 30 of them, and we just have the 170 overall. So those are hourly pay heads?
They're hourly, and they're not full-time. I think most of them are 4 hours a day, but I'm not 100% sure. But they work different. They're not exactly all uniform either, but they're mostly part-time positions, which is why they're lower cost than the subs.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to the areas where we think we can find some savings to reallocate towards these continuing costs. First, we have permanent salaries. So a good chunk of this $650,000 that you're seeing is about $300,000 from funds that we were able to carry forward in Title I as a result of utilizing year-end balances in FY20. So those of you on the Finance Committee probably heard that before, but it might be new to the rest of you. That gave us an additional $300,000 to make use of in this year's budget. And the remaining $350,000 or so is from turnover, vacancies, late hires, retirements since we did the budget process, et cetera, where we've had some additional savings. So that's valued at about $350,000 here. Temp salaries, much of this is budgets for temp and day-to-day sub positions that were not hired kind of due to the different way we're doing schooling this year and challenges associated with temp hiring. And this balance is like roughly enough to reconstitute in order to sustain for the rest of the year the new positions that I just described on the last slide that we hired as a result of the pandemic. So the building subs and the building aides. So it's kind of utilizing those funds in a different manner, but that's why we're seeing so much in savings for temp salaries. It's just kind of the different way that we've had we've engaged temporary employees this year. So just under $600,000 in that category. Student resource officers, as you all know, was a reduction that took place after the budget process, and those savings were not reallocated to this point. So proposing that we reallocate the value of the budget for the student resource officers, which was about $150,000. Student transportation is really a combination of crossing guards. So with school being 4 days a week, you wouldn't necessarily immediately think that, oh, there's savings in crossing guards, but it's actually 20% cheaper. And then additionally, savings at Metro and Casco Bay lines, both stemming from the significant reduction in high school students traveling to school on a daily basis. Field trips, again, probably self-explanatory. Field trips are just not happening right now. So this is primarily field trip transportation. And athletics, so in coordination with the high school ADs and with activity leaders at the middle school, some of whom you heard from earlier this evening, the savings here represents kind of the combined expected savings as a result of limitations to what we can do in the context of the pandemic, and specifically areas such as transportation, rentals, stipends, game workers, supplies, et cetera. So a combination of all of those things, projections came from the ADs and the activity leaders looking forward. Staff travel and parking, so conference travel, PHS, the parking lot is fairly, actually fairly expensive and it's not being utilized. So we've got some savings there. And then the board contingency at about $85,000. So altogether it comes to just a hair under $2 million. And I see I have a hand raised. Ms. Thompson.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is for the superintendent. So when we had this conversation around the SROs, there was discussion around reallocating those funds for training in other ways. Are you reallocating it here because we're not in person and therefore you don't need that additional training that we had talked about the money being used for, or for the social emotional learning? And then the second question is, after you take the 85 from the board contingency, what is left there?
So I'll answer the first question, and then Lorena can help with the second one.
Thank you.
That's correct. We made that reduction in the SRO, the elimination of the SRO, and then a commitment on the part of the board to redirect those resources to support the needs that would be created. But given where we are in terms of both the way that we're providing instruction this year, as well as, what we need to be able to continue these services, we are putting this into the projected savings so that it can be used for this purpose. Under ideal circumstances, we would want to sort of hold that in a separate box and say, like, we are going to use this, when the time comes for services that would be the replacement of that. There is a process in place now that is starting to revisit what comes next, and looking at all of our law enforcement policies. And so from that will come a direction, and that would be something for the next budget and not for this year's budget.
Okay, so the reasoning behind that, again, we were going to use it for social emotional learning and for trainings and so on and so forth. Because we're not in person, you're reallocating it here, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Because we have not formulated what
right.
Appropriate use of it would be. We, that's one. And two is we have $4 million worth of things that we need to do.
You're going out, Javier.
We have $4 million worth of things that we need to be able to do this year, and limited places to go and say, here's an unallocated amount.
So when you go to do the budget for the next, are you going to request that the 150,000 plus be put back in as if it never disappeared here, so that we can reallocate those funds as the board had requested when we got rid of the SROs? That's a plan?
It's close to the way that, obviously the budget process is the budget process. The idea would be that what comes out of the work that is currently happening around the law enforcement policies, that we would then make a decision as to whether that is something that needs to be in the budget.
I don't know what's going. I'm sorry. I don't know if anyone else is struggling to hear you, Superintendent, but you like go in and out quite a bit. So I think I got the most part of it, but so thank you very much. And Miranda, can you talk about the board contingency?
Yep, and just to add just one thing to the other question, the student resource officers were budgeted in FY21, so they're still in the budget. We're just using it for something different this time. So when we go to start next year's budget, it's kind of like it's still there. We're just using it in a different way this time, right? So like that's it's not really disappearing. It would still be something that would be a point of discussion if it were to change for FY22. And for the contingency, that's the full board contingency. So that was the board contingency used to be 111,000, I think, and it was reduced in the FY21 budget versus the FY20 budget. So that's the full contingency, but it's not the full board budget. But I do not have that figure handy at the moment. I believe there's some contractual services, some supplies, and some dues and fees, and so that's not representative of like the board budget. That's just the contingency line, but that is the full line.
Okay, so my question, Superintendent or Javier, on that is in the past as well, and I know the board is not traveling anywhere, but we've also utilized those funds to pay for emergencies such as boilers and so on and so forth. So I take it that this is probably our emergency and wipes us out completely. Therefore, we have no money until the next budget. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. You feel comfortable without having any kind of emergency backup?
I was comfortable with it as I feel with everything else that you're going to hear on the next slide. Okay, makes me a little nervous, but I certainly understand the reasoning, but it just makes me a little nervous that we've always had that cushion there in case a boiler went or something, that the board could step up and pay for those unexpected. So wiping out completely, I understand, but it makes me a little bit nervous, but thank you. Yeah, and you'll see next slide that there's more to be nervous about.
More to go? Is that what you just said?
More to be nervous about.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, thank you.
I was going to respond in a slightly different way, but I can. What's that?
The chase. That's why we like him a lot. Just what
I'll say, because we are going to talk about it a little bit more, but I just. Maybe it makes more sense to save this for later, but, just to be clear, like I am, proposing these savings for reallocation because I've identified them as available, but that's not the only thing that, is available for managing unknowns and things to come up in the future. So a lot of not just this board contingent, this board contingent is actually quite small in terms of managing the unknowns of $120 million school district budget. So in reality, a big way that we are managing unknowns and changes and variables each year is through these salary savings of turnover and vacancy. These kind of turnover savings is what I call it. It's quite substantial in a large budget like this. So when I say that I've identified 650,000 in permanent salaries and benefits, that's not all the savings that's there. I'm retaining and preserving some managerial balances for moving forward, recognizing we're only 30% through this year right now. We cannot be, cutting it close. We can't go over budget by law. So, that's part of my job is to manage that. And so I just want to make clear that I am doing that as part of this whole presentation. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But.
No, I appreciate that because turnover savings in the past has been kind of the do not say word because of how it was utilized in the past. So I certainly trust your expertise, Miranda. But that word turnover savings has come back to bite us pretty bad. So it just makes me, apprehensive as well. But certainly I know you're very talented at the helm there. So.
Okay, well, we'll continue. And, certainly we can discuss that more towards the end, but it probably will be easier to do once we get through kind of the rest of the slides. So does anybody else have any questions before I proceed or? Okay. All right, so funding sources, additional funding sources on top of kind of identified savings. We have the CARES contingency, which we discussed as part of the FY21 budget process. So this is a different type of CARES funding. So we have CRF funding that came through the CARES Act. This is a different type of CARES funding. So the CRF came through the Treasury, and the ESSER funding, the world's worst acronym, came through the US DOE. And so it was more designed for schools, or at least that's my interpretation of it. And this actually has, is much more flexible, and we can use this balance through FY22. And this is also the grant that we utilize to budget approximately $1.3 million in custodial services this year. This $650,000 represents the balance that was left from the grant after taking into account the cost of the custodians that was budgeted for this year. So that's what that represents. And then the Medicaid reimbursement fund balance, which those of you on the Finance Committee are familiar with, but the rest of you very well may not be. This is a fund balance that has been kind of in existence for several years and has rolled over year over year. And it's from a time back when Medicaid revenue that we received was not directly budgeted, but was deposited to a grant fund and utilized only as needed. And so as a result, over time, a balance built up. And while we tend to count it kind of as part of our fund balances, it's actually managed as a grant, which makes sense because it was an outside funding source, non-local funding source. But because of that, we have some flexibility in terms of being able to utilize it, whereas dipping into any local fund balances would require council and referendum approval to expend. So these are some additional funding sources to add to the mix. So this slide really is just intended to bring everything that I just said together on one slide so you can see where we end up bottom line wise. So the costs are on the left with the staffing costs at $3 million that I discussed before, the day programming at 1.8, and the food services snack comes to the 4.9 million previously discussed. And just the one change here on this slide is adding to the discussion the projected cost of enacting the minimum wage if we were to do so. And that would bring us to approximately $5 million in unbudgeted costs all told. And then you have on the right the savings and the funding sources that I just discussed that come to 3.3 million. And comparing our available funding to our unbudgeted costs, that leaves us with a gap of 1.7 million.
Quick clarifying question.
Yes.
That gap includes the minimum wage of $85,000?
It does.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
But a further clarifying question, we're not paying the hazard pay now, right?
We are not.
Let me just elaborate on that since you bring it up. I mean, we have, and the board has seen the memorandum from our attorney that concurs with the city attorney's decision that the minimum wage ordinance is not applicable until January of 22, and that as a result, the hazard pay requirements that were built into that provision can't go into effect because the entire thing doesn't go into effect until January 22nd. There is obviously, as you all know, there is that is not a sort of universally accepted position, and there is a court case that has been filed by a series of plaintiffs associated with the Chamber of Commerce to get a declaratory judgment so that this can be resolved once and for all. And so we are, cognizant of it, going with our attorney's advice. And at that point, that's why we've not started to make those payments. But once the declaratory judgment comes, if that is something that is found to be, that it is going into effect, then we obviously will pay that. And my understanding is that is, they've filed it and are asking for declaratory judgment. So that means like quick.
Okay, so if there's no other questions, I'm actually going to turn it over to the superintendent to talk a little bit more about the recommendation itself.
So as I said earlier, this is our recommendation. My recommendation is that we continue the school-based staffing, and that we do that by reallocating the savings from all of those areas that we've discussed. And we emphasize in here if needed, because as Miranda said, we have, it's the first third of the year. And as we look at where the budget, where the budget actually is moving, then there could be the potential for some additional savings in other places. And, that's the reason that we have the full contingency sort of on the table. So when, Board Member Thompson asked if I was nervous about the 85,000, I'm nervous about the 85,000. I'm much more nervous about the, 650,000 in CARES funding that is also, committed here. And I'm also more nervous about the 650 in the Medicaid funding that is also here. So, there's lots of reasons to be nervous about it, and that's why we emphasize that if needed, because we expect that we will have some additional savings along the way that we could potentially not have to use the whole of our CARES and Medicaid funding. And in fact, you'll see that in the next slide where we're going to actually get into what this actually looks like. So do you want to tee that up, Miranda? Thank you. So this is the same slide that you just saw, but we've whited out those areas where, we are not looking to make the, to make the investment. So you can see that we've eliminated the costs associated with the day programming, before and after care, and the remote day supports. And so we've also, to our previous conversation, not accounted for the minimum wage expenditures. With that, you can see over on the cost side that we have offset about $160,000 in costs that we had, budgeted or savings that we had, or sort of investment that we had budgeted from the Medicaid fund to sort of come out with a zero balance. So this is, in a way, just modeling what we envision being able to do as additional savings become available, that those savings would be reductions in how much of those contingency funds we would need to actually access in order to be able to keep us at that balanced zero. So that's the big picture of how we are approaching this. And then I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the specifics. So we touched on this. You saw these numbers in one of the earlier slides where we talked about how many FTE were in the different areas. So we thought it would be worth sort of just showing and zeroing in on this particular piece so that you're able to see where those staffing resources are. And in the next slide, we'll talk about what the implications are of those, of not doing some of those positions. So you can see that a huge part of this is the backfills for folks who have leaves and where we needed to be able to fill their positions, and as they moved into remote academy. So those remote academy backfills are a big part of our costs. I do want to remind you, we went through this back when we were reopening, that we also did make some reductions in our schools to offset where we could, and people were moving into those remote academy classrooms. And so if enough kids moved out of a
school building, we, in some cases, were able to eliminate those positions and just transfer those. So there are more than 32 people in the remote academy is the bottom line with that. And so these were just the ones where we weren't able to absorb that with reductions at the school level. The remote academy additions are the sort of the support structure to enable us to be able to run the remote academy. Art, music, and PE additions, additional staffing for ELL and special education, and then the building subs and the building aides, which we've talked a couple of times about how critical those positions are to our being able to to manage school in the way that we're managing school, and to be able to have the resources on site to substitute for people when they're out. Somebody who's embedded in the building and able to, quickly just be a part of the building and know what's going on and move in. And you also saw in the reductions piece that we have significant savings in some of the substitute and temporary positions. So those in essence offset each other. So those, if we were to discontinue those, we would probably see a loss of the savings in those other areas. So just the program implications, the remote academy, I think I spent a little bit of time walking through that. So this is what allows us to run our remote academy and our hybrid in-person schooling. So this is the backfills that we had to do in order to be able to accommodate all of those people going on leaves and be able to staff appropriately at both the remote academy and at our brick and mortar schools. The remote academy adds a little bit more detail on that would be the remote academy administrator position, the secretary, the part-time ed tech support, part-time art, and part-time reading intervention support that we built in, as well as some of the supplies and contractual supports and things along those lines that make, the remote academy have a support structure that is consistent with what we have at our other schools. We did not start in this place, but then as we've started to run the remote academy in order to make it robust and meet the needs of our students and staff, we've had to add these supports along the way to make it happen. The specials, Miranda touched on this, are critical for us to be able to create the necessary prep time for our teachers to be able to have their contractual prep times, their contractual times for meeting with each other, as well as to be able to keep our classrooms safe, clean classrooms, and be able to do the necessary work to work with their students who are remote on the days that they are, on the days that they're remote. So that's having, meetings, morning meetings, or sort of check-in meetings with our students, as well as giving them feedback on the work that they're doing when they are not in person in school. And so the specials additions are pivotal to that. And so, we obviously have more than, the 8 or, I don't remember, is it 8 positions? Sort of, let me go to my, the 8.5 positions. We have more than that. Those were the ones that we needed to add to be able to have the level of support that we needed. We also did it in a way that would allow us to not have those specials teachers having to move
to many classrooms over the course of the week. If you recall, that was a major concern at the time that we reopened, was the exposure for those teachers. So this has enabled us to be able to have where they work with a cluster of classes for a period of time, then they move on to a different cluster, and on the kids side that they're still getting the specials that they expect. So that's where those additions went in. The ELL additions, which are relatively small, 3 additional staff, and that's been pivotal to be able to ensure that we are able to bring back our IELD students for more time. I think, this is by no means enough to be able to do everything that we would want to do. So one of the things that has suffered in the process is our ability to provide support to students who are in regular classes and would still benefit from getting assistance and monitoring support from their ELL teachers. So that's suffered as a result of this, but this is what we needed just to be able to have the level of staffing that would allow us to be able to bring IELD students back for 4 days of instruction, most of it in person. In some schools, it is, a mix of in-person and remote. Then some additional special ed ads that we needed to make to make sure that we could serve both the in-person and remote needs of students, and then the building subs and the building aids that we've talked about. So that's the sort of the value proposition for everything that we have added in this, in the restart, and the things that I'm proposing that we prioritize for maintaining as CRF funds end. And then the last thing that we wanted to do was just to talk briefly about what the losses are as well on the community partner side. So what we laid out for you is who those partners are, and then the number of students that are enrolled in each of those partners and the overall cost. This is the overall cost to maintain the program through the end of the year. So this is not what we've paid them to date. This is, what we project the costs would be with their current cost structure if we were to continue that through the end of the year. So on this page, you see all of the full day service. So these are the services that are in place. So when students are not in school in person, so on the days that they're off of their cohort, then they would go to these different community-based programs. And so we have been paying all of the costs associated with that out of CRF for this 3-month period. And then on the next slide, you see the extended day. So this is the before and after care at REC, as well as some of the other programming that we've been able to add to provide sort of, we have a shortened school day. That was a design decision that we made. And so this is supporting those activities that allow students to get some additional time on, social emotional supports and, activities that keep them engaged outside of the regular school day. So, that's the bulk of what these services are. So I think that's really all that we wanted to share with you, and then just hear your thoughts and answer your questions ahead of what we hope will be a vote to support that recommendation at the next board meeting.
Ms. Bondo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions, Superintendent. I'm leaning a little bit on to support the recommendation, but I just need to get some clarification. When I look at the full picture for the recommendation, I don't see. I just want to understand for our staff childcare, the ongoing for the staff, because we know that we have our staff and they need childcare for the when they're in person. So we have some ongoing childcare expanded for them. So do we have any cost associated with those childcare, or is something is not reflecting on the full picture here?
Yeah, it's not reflected in the full picture. So there's about $120,000 that we expect that will be the continuing costs. We are primarily using some of the money that we've been able to raise through the foundation's efforts. I can't remember specifically which fund it is that we have received a significant amount of money, and that would be one of the areas that we're prioritizing using the philanthropic contributions that we've received to support that, and then patching it together with other requests, as well as continuing to fundraise for that.
Okay, so at least done. Okay, thank you. So now I see what we have with the community partners, and I heard when you said the most priority reason is about the social emotion, because when the students are not in person, so exactly those programs are keeping them busy and make them going with some social activities. So I'm wondering about the communication with the parents, because when we have our staff already been taking care, the other percentage is what we've been serving some other parents in the community. So what's the communication and different options? Then we can propose to the parents, because they need to be prepared to find some from other options to try to make sure.
We don't have other options. We have communicated with parents to let them know that this was my recommendation, and that if the board adopts this recommendation, that the program would not be that we would no longer be paying for it. Some of the programs will continue. So specifically, we've had conversations with REC about their ability to continue to provide the, before and after care, even after our funding dries out. And it's a work in progress. None of this is finalized. But in that particular case, what they would do is to return to charging families that can afford it the rate that they would normally charge. That this is the first time ever that that's been fully paid for by the district or the city for all participants. And so that is something that we've done that has never been done before. And then they have been able to, they always have a certain amount of money that they use for what they call scholarships to pay for students who cannot afford, whose parents cannot afford to pay for REC. And so they are, they've been able to, in essence, bank that for the first 3 months, because we've been paying for everyone in the program. And so they're able to use what they banked in the first 3 months, plus what they had for the next 6 months, and they'll be able to carry, they hope, the majority of the students who cannot afford to pay the REC rates. So that's one place where that program will largely continue, but it will be obviously different for families who've been able to get it for free that will now, in some cases, have to pay for it. So that's one place where we have some ability to continue it. And some of the other programs will, they've existed before and will continue to exist after. And, they just might not be available to the same families, or they might not, or those families will have to pay for the programming.
All right. Thank you. My last question is about the social emotion. What we have done is because to try to reduce the isolation that our students may, they really have during this time. So are we thinking about summer replacement or summer support? Because they won't be able to access some of them. Maybe some of the parents won't be able to afford anymore. So what are we doing on our side to try to improve the area, to make sure that we can support them because of those isolation? Because we need to make sure that it's going to increase, because some of the students, they won't be able to access those opportunities to reduce those isolation and to work on the social emotion.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and we don't have, a replacement. So I just want to be clear about that there's nothing that we are, putting in place that is, the same as what we currently have. That's the sort of the big, point of this conversation. But we have said that improving what happens during those remote, those days that students are remote, is a key priority, and re-engaging and supporting the students that, are less engaged, the students that are, chronically absent, the students that are, sort of doing the work but not well, that is a priority for us in the second half of the year. So I don't have a specific answer for this is exactly what it's going to look like, but know that is, as we think about what are the things that we're focused on for the second half of the year, it is just, it's being able to focus on improving remote instruction for everyone. And that includes providing the links, the social emotional support that we strive to provide when kids are in person, and being able to do that remotely, and then re-engaging those students who are less engaged than we would want them to be. That, and it could be for a variety of reasons, but re-engaging those students. And then the third thing that we're focused on is being able to continue those supports for our most in need populations, our special education and IELD students. So even like what we call essential school, making sure that we're able to do that even if we go into a all remote situation for everyone else.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bando. Mr. Burke?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Superintendent, first of all, I just wanted to hold up, as you said, just how heartbreaking this is. And it's part of the package that we all knew, although we all hoped the situation would be different at this point of the year. And because of the inaction at a federal level for about 6 months to come up with any other support, this is where we are. I want to applaud you for even putting this together in the first place, and even your efforts to direct $4 million to families to support them through the pandemic, which was unfortunately not supported through the state, which I can kind of get my head around at a bureaucratic level, but we really we're looking to support families in every which way that we can. And I just want to hold up your efforts in doing that, because I know what comes through our inboxes, and I don't know that we all appreciate with what heart and rigor you have approached trying to do school this year. So that's a period. That's a big emphasis for me. And then I just have some clarifying questions. So just first of all, who has been eligible for the services paid through this thus far? It's just been anybody, right? There was a certain number of slots and people, but there was no income restrictions or anything. Okay. Just do we know the socioeconomic demographics of who are using the slots that are being paid for by us currently?
We don't. We have not looked at it at the socioeconomics. We have looked at the demographics. So, to the extent that demographics track, fairly closely with, with free and reduced lunch, we can look at it that way.
So you can say approximately 50% as a round estimate. Okay. And just curious, I'm not expecting the foundation to solve this, but have we heard anything from the Foundation for Portland Public Schools about any philanthropic activity or opportunities that might support this need? Not necessarily through them, but is there any effort out in the world for those that do have means to come up with $1.7 million to do so?
Not at that level. So I think we've been very successful sort of against historical markers for our foundation in terms of fundraising around the pandemic. And, as I mentioned earlier, it's the foundation's work that is going to allow us to be able to continue the remote day services for the families of our staff, for the children of our staff, which has been a big priority, one of the commitments that we made at the reopening of schools. So, they've been very successful in that, but, it's really hard for us to, in Maine, be moving at the $1.7 million clip.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And truly, thanks for doing all that you could to try to do the most with what we had. And I'm sorry that we haven't seen action from other levels of government to continue supporting our community and our families the way that we need to through the pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. Ms. Russell-Better.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Superintendent, I just wanted to clarify. I know Member Bondo, you were answering some of her question, but I just wanted to clarify. I think the number of students doing rec was 300 something. Does that sound right? And so it sounds like you were thinking that the scholarship funding, will those, I guess my question is, will the families know? I have a child in rec, so I know I got the letter and I felt like it was, explaining what was going on, but I just am wondering, will they have the information and will families know, whether they're able to get that funding? Because that would be starting January, right? Because I would imagine families who are able to pay got the email and will understand that that's what they'll have to do. But for families, I'm just wondering if you know that process.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with the letter that we sent out. I also, and I think that Molly Myers, who, oh no, she's no longer in the audience. Molly is been the person operating the program. I don't know if Grace is here. I guess what I was going to say is I believe that we actually that REC also sent information to families separate and apart from our communication.
Yeah, that's what I meant. I'm sorry. That was the email that I was thinking of, was their email. Yeah.
We sent something out to families that are enrolled in all of the programs, not just REC, on Friday of last week, letting them know that we were, that this was going to be my recommendation, and that if the recommendation was accepted, that the programs would not continue after we come back from the winter break. So I believe that REC is having a more specific conversation with parents about, collecting the information that they need to be able to make decisions about whether they can offer scholarships or whether people are going to be asked to pay for the continued services.
Okay, so I guess, I feel like a lot of the other pieces we have so little control over, and it just is, right, with these other programs. But I guess I just feel that responsibility of the REC being, in our buildings, and something that, families have accessed and depended on. And I know the other programs will affect families as much, but I guess I'm just thinking of families that may rely for their work, to want them to be able to know, if in January they will in fact get that, the scholarship funding. So I guess I would just put in a plug for us to find that out or be able to advocate for those families. That's just where my thinking went.
I mean, we have had those conversations with REC. I think that they're fully intending to be able to do that to the maximum extent that their budget allows. I think for everybody to know that, REC took very significant cuts at the city level this year. They lost 30 positions, so it's not like they are just sitting around swimming in money. So I commend them for the way that they've tackled this challenge and really stepped up to the plate, and I am confident they will continue to do that.
I will just say I've been just amazed by them, and knowing that they've had to do limited numbers of students and having to do all the same protocols our educators have to with limiting how many kids they can have. Thank you. I think the other question, Superintendent, I don't know if Miranda could help with this. This may be a silly question, but I really didn't understand this. So, Miranda, when you're talking about the CARES funding that the district was able to access and use, the 10.5 million, I believe, and I think you'd said the total was like 14. I guess I'm just trying to understand, and I know there's something about the process of having to use it by a certain point. But does that money just go back to the state, or like what happens? Like what happens there? Like it's just something that if you don't follow the certain criteria, it just can't be used, and unless you can get a waiver, which that's not happening.
So we got allocations originally based on, enrollment and other factors. And those allocations added up to 14 million. And so we claimed essentially 10.5 million. We had to submit our application by, there were 2 rounds of funding. And their second round, the application, I think, was due mid-November or so. So at that point, the state, it enabled the state to potentially use those resources in other ways. So, and then if if there's some money left in the grants at the end, if we weren't able to spend every single penny, that would also then go back to the state and ultimately the feds, presumably, with no reason to think at this point that there's going to be an extension.
Okay. And then my other question is just, so say some federal, legislation is passed and we get some federal aid, we don't know that, right? But I'm just trying to understand, in us making this decision about these programs right now, like in theory, if that were to happen, say in the next month, are those programs, to be able to reintroduce, is that a process that's really difficult? Like, I'm just trying to understand, like, if for some reason we did end up getting federal help that could be directed towards this kind of family support, like, is that like implementing that again? I mean, I guess we just don't know, right? Because all those programs, like you said, are freestanding and do their own. But, in theory, is that something we could offer again to families? Just is there anything planning wise or structurally that would be difficult?
We would definitely gear up to try to reinstate the programs to the extent that our partners would be able to reinstate them. So no guarantees, but we called them one day in August and said, this is happening. We'd like for you to come to a meeting, and 70 of them showed up, and then we wound up with these programs. So there was tremendous sense of commitment to helping us to reopen school, which I'm incredibly and eternally grateful for. And, I'm sure they would be there again if we were in a position to do that. And obviously, the less time that lags, the more likely that it would be for us to be able to do something. So if the, Congress were to move on something in, in the next couple of weeks before they break for the winter, then, it would be great, because then we would know that this is a potential, thing that it's just a matter of seeing when the money comes in, and we might be able to do something, which would be really different than if, like, we go off to break with no money, and then we have to wait for them to come back after the inauguration and start a whole new Congress. That obviously lags significantly, and it'll be harder for people to start back up. And parents obviously what they're going to be doing in lieu of this.
Okay, thank you. It just helps me get my head around, we have to make a decision, but really, like, probably everything with COVID, it's like taking it one day, 1 week at a time, knowing that, things could be, like you're saying, having to ramp something up again. So that helps me just kind of not knowing, but knowing that we would have the option that these community partners did step up, and you guys all figured this plan out on the fly. So thank you for explaining that. It's helpful.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Russell-Better. Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess, well, first of all, thank you for the presentation, and, obviously the recommendation being a really challenging place to even begin the conversation. I was going to ask about the reg spots, the 319 one. So I was happy that we were able to talk about that already. I thought it was also helpful to mention, as part of some of the comments that were just made, we, as a result of the finance committee conversation, we met with the city manager and mayor and members of the finance committee, just to update them of what we're looking at. And they also did not have $1.7 million laying around. So although it was a good informative session, and to let them know what we were doing, it did not yield, a solution. I guess what I wanted to add, and I don't know if I can frame this as a question as much as just a thought, as we a side debate the recommendation. A lot of what we're trying to keep in place in terms of staffing, from the specials, the building subs, and aides are things that are in place for us to maintain our safety and health protocols, right? To limit the extent of exposure for COVID. At the same time, by eliminating the childcare services, we in the community potentially increase the risk of COVID exposure, as these families have to resort to other means of their children being, under supervision when they're not in school. We're fortunate that these facilities that we're using have safety and health protocols in place, but absent those structures, I'm worried about that. Again, reminding everyone that we're having this conversation while we're seeing a really rapid and alarming increase of COVID cases, record-breaking numbers each day. So that's something that's difficult for me to ignore at this time. And again, I'm having trouble framing that into a question, but I thought it was worth adding as a thought process. We have 2 weeks. I can't imagine much will change, but I think we'll have 2 weeks to hopefully see if anything else surfaces. Otherwise, this recommendation seems to be, at this moment, the best path forward. But again, definitely not a positive one, as it still leaves us a lot of uncertain territory further ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Burke.
Yeah, sorry, just real quick, wanted to say, for the record, publicly, what I chatted, which was thank you to Miranda for always packaging very complex information in a way that we can digest, and answering our questions with great clarity, calm, and patience with us. So just thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Burke, and I will echo those sentiments and the appreciation of how Miranda makes our budget so accessible. So with deep appreciation. And I also wanted to echo Mr. Burke's comments, appreciating the superintendent's, the extent to which the superintendent and his team have tried to support our families through all of this, and how hard what a tough juncture we're at right now. But I agree with the need to prioritize our own continued staffing so we can keep our schools open and our kids learning. That said, I wanted to raise one additional issue that we touched on a little bit, but with regards to hazard pay, I read the legal opinion from our attorney and understand that it is in line with the city's attorney that the hazard pay provision doesn't actually come into effect until 2022. I do think it is clearly not the intent of the voters, that provision was geared towards recognizing the greater risk that people are taking by doing their jobs in the middle of a pandemic. So that's here and now, and I know this issue may be resolved by the courts very soon, and potentially prior to our next board meeting on the 22nd. But I think to follow the will of the voters, that we should be paying the additional hazard pay, recognizing the additional risk that folks are putting themselves in order to serve our students. So I just wanted to add that. Again, that's just my personal opinion. Thank you, everyone. I think that's it unless the superintendent had anything else to close out tonight. Okay. I want to thank, in particular, Haley, Emily, and Tessa for sticking it out through a very long meeting. I know you have school tomorrow morning. It's 10:40, so thank you. Great job at your first meeting. Welcome again to the new board members, and our next meeting is December 22nd. So thank you all. Thank you to the superintendent, and have a great night.